So we've got Visual Studio. We're also supposed to start learning how Visual Studio works. So let's take this as an intro lesson. There's some stuff that we've done previously, but let's get to understand how Visual Studio works. So for the version that we're working with, this is Visual Studio 2015. It's lighter on most computers because it doesn't require too much processing power, and it gives us the basics of what we might need to learn and to know about our Visual Studio. So, for example, if I go to the About, it then tells us that we're working with Visual Basic, and this is 2015. The .NET framework is 4.8, and it's a version 14. That's the Visual Studio that we're working with. And anything that is running .NET 4.8 can be able to run within this particular project. So it then becomes different from every other language we've been working with because this creates a graphical user interface. So there's certain things that we need to learn about our Visual Basic, which is when we have created a project like this, the title of the project is at the top where it says example code. We've got a server explorer whereby we can actually create a bunch of servers. We've got a toolbox that shows us the various elements we can work with. We've got our data sources that help us to create a number of applications or values that we can work with. So some of the things we can actually be able to create through Microsoft platforms, whereby we can work with an Excel sheet, we can work with a Word document, we can work with Microsoft Access, we can also include PowerPoint. At the same time, this section where I've got my Form 1 becomes my starting point, where this is the platform that I work with. So there's the designer, which is the Form 1. If I right click or F7, I can get to my code, which is public class, Form 1, end class. So if you remember, we did classes C++. We also did we can do classes in PHP as well. So we work with classes. So it's the same concept with our classes, only we'll be using them in a slightly different manner to what we've had before. And then at the same time, the moment we have created our project, we'll have a folder that contains our project and project values. So I think if I run the project, I'm not sure if you'll be able to see the output. Let me just run it. And I think in your output, you may not be able to see the form itself, but at the moment it's still building. So when it's done, I think I will share it so that you can see what is happening. So whilst we're waiting for that, maybe we can just take a few notes to what we would want to do. Basically, what we are doing with Visual Basic, we want to create a Windows application. So everything that we are working with will benefit a Windows application or will give reference to a Windows application. So we design it in 3 forms. Would need a database, would need an interface, would need the code. So if we are working with Visual Basic, we then need to create those three aspects individually. So when we're working with those aspects, it then means we need to understand fully what that system is about. I think on your output, you might not be able to see this. Let me just go back to Google. I re-share the output so that you see what the output gives us before we proceed. So for example, if I show you the form, this is what my form looks like. So I've got form 1 and there's nothing on it. I've got the minimize, I've got the maximize, I've got the close, so that if I want to close my form, I can be able to close that particular form and also use whatever elements I may want to present on my form. So if I click on the X, I close the running application and I can go back to my code. So let me go back to Visual Basic so that we proceed. So we're back to Visual Basic now. So let's get some of the things in order that we want to learn. The first aspect is our interface, which I think is the fastest and best way to start learning, whereby we need to get the idea behind what our interface should be doing. So to do that, we go to our toolbox, which is on the left. We go to our various elements that we want to work with. The easiest element to actually work with, or the easiest elements that we can work with, are as follows. We can have a button, which automatically creates an object. We can also have a text box, which is that one there. We can also have a label, which is that one there. So let's just make sure our content is in order. So we've got our label, we've got our text box, we've got our button. I think someone is trying to join our class. Let me admit them. Right. So given that, we've created three objects, but these objects are meaningless in themselves being objects on our form. So we then need to give value to what these objects are. So each object, if I click on the label, it's an object on its own. If I click on the text box, it's also an object on its own. If I click on the button, it's also an object of its own. So we want to put some reference to this. Let me create a file so that we get to see what we are talking about. It's easier to work within Visual Basic so that at least we can be able to see what some of these things are. So we've got three objects, which is our label, our button, and our text box. So we've got a label, button, and a text box. So we want to name these elements. So each of these elements has the following. So a label, there's a name property, name property is also a text property, like that. So for the label, we want to call it value. For the button, we want to call it process. For the text box, we want to call it input. And then the text property would want to get number, becomes the text property. For our button, we want this to also be proceed. For the text box, it will have no property whatsoever. So let's explain why we are doing it this way. We are saying we want a label. We want a label and we want the name property to be value. We want a button. We want the name property to be process. We want a text box and we want the name property to be input. The text property will then call it number for the label. And then for the button, we'll call it proceed because we want to be able to get whatever the button is supposed to give us as an output. So we'll get to view what this does in our working with the code. So let's go back to our design. In our design, we then want to first work with the label. The label we gave the name property value and the text property number. So we select our label, we go to properties in the corner, we then go to the text property, and we said this is a number. And then the name property, I think we called it value. So after the text property, we look for where it's written name, design, and that's name. We want to call this value. So we've got number and value. Why is this important? Each element that we add to our form is regarded as an object. So anytime we want to then change certain things, we can actually refer to that particular object and change certain attributes or aspects of our object. Same applies for our text box. Our text box, we said we want this to have the name input. So we come to our text box, we look for where we have the name property, and then we call this input. So our label and our text box are done. The last element we want is our button, which is process and proceed. So the name property would then be process, and then the text property would then be proceed. Right, so we've got name and a text property. So we've got our label, we've got our button, we've got our text box. So this becomes part of the design. We now want to have the code section of our system. So if we go to our form, we can now be able to put some code within the code section. So how do we do that? We go to this section where it's written form 1, and we then need to know which element we want to work with. So if it's the process, that's our button. We can then go to the right side. We select click, and we have created some code for our button. The next element we then now need to work with is to say what code can we put within our button. So the simplest code we can work with is the following. We can then say we want to get our input from the text box. And then we want to get that value within that text box and display it somewhere on our form or using a separate object. So we can then say input dot text yes. Okay. Right. Number pause and chat. Are we understanding where we're coming from with this before we start getting into some code? So we've done some of the content. So let's maybe add a bit of context to our design, and we take it from there. Right. So we want to say if an individual puts some text there, the moment we click on proceed, we get the information that has been entered into our text box, and we use it with our button. So let's redo our code. For example, if you remember in the previous languages, we also had a comment. So in Visual Basic, if we put a single quote, we can make a comment. So let's get into something that we are also familiar with, right? We can create variables, and to create our variables, we simply put PIM. We can put num as integer, right? And then we want to initialize num to be equal to something. So we can say num is equal to, what did we call our text box? What did we call our text box? If we go back to our notes, we called our text box input, correct? Right. So we want to say the following. Input dot text. Right. Now it's giving us a problem. using your history of working with variables, what could be our issue? We put num is equal to input.txt. What could be the issue there? Because it's highlighted in red and it's telling us there's a declaration that is expected. What could be our issue with line 4? Okay, the hint is in something that will be explained when we started. We said our input is an object. We said our num is a variable. Can we use an object and a variable in the same context? Yes or no? Can we use a variable which is of a specific type and an object which is of a specific type in the same context? Students, help me out here. Can we use it in the same context? Our input is a type, is a different type. Our num is also a different type. How can we correct it? And we can proceed. Line 3 tells us we want to declare a variable. And how do we declare a variable in this instance? We simply put dim, we then put num as integer. So it means line 3 has declared a variable called num. At the same time now, our line was not working because it was not in the right perspective. So we then simply say we want the value of our num to be whatever is within our input. So we've got input.text, which we are converting to integer and getting a integer value. But at the same time, I'll also ask you another question. If we start by having a variable that has not been initialized as the first element, will it not give us a problem? Boza tanga taisa num wacho asina value, tobva tati num wedu ndiye achaita whatever has been put in our input. So will that not give us a problem somewhere? Okay, so let us proceed. So like we said, we want to be able to use our variable in that particular manner. So we replace input taken with our num, like that. So as you can see, num accepts that aspect. But if you remember, I was asking you, have we actually initialized our num? So if we run our project, I think for the sake of progress, I'll just let you know what it's doing. You can go through this video and test it yourselves as we proceed. And as I'm also recording, you can be able to view what the output was. Right, so let me enter a number in my input, which if you remember, this is our input. I click on proceed, and then it tells me 0. Why would it tell me 0? So if we go back to our code, we need to initialize num before we get to our message box. So line 7 and line 6 should switch places. So if I cut my line 7, I delete that bit, I paste my line 6, and I run the program, I should be able to get a different result. So let's say I put 25, and in this particular instance now, my input is now 25, and I've correctly added my code. I've correctly added my code that we can work with. So let's get to maybe something that's a bit uh, more user friendly, if we can put it that way. So let's add 3 more inputs, and then we still want to work with our process, our proceed, and then get some output. So we want to add another text box, and a label. So the next label, we also want to put a number. We want another text box. And we also want our final text box to give us a specific element, and would want the following to be done to our elements. So we've got text box, text box, and we want a label. So the next text box, we want num1. The next name property, we want to be operator. The next value, we want it to be number. And the name property, we want to be a number. sorry, this won't work. Let's actually change the name property to num var1, and we want this to be num. Okay, so the reason why we will do this is the following. We want to be able to work with our values, and our values need to have unique representations of each element because we are dealing with objects. So we come to our text box. That's the first one we change. And this, I think we said it's num1. This we change to OP. This we change to num var1, and then this I think we can put it as number, and the name property will be num var1. So like we've done, we've got num1, we've got our OP, we've got our input. So what might then end up being confusing is if we don't know what each element is, we might not be able to use our content in the right order. So let's go to our code. And in our code, we want to do the following. So right, I'm actually realizing you might need a lot of code. So let's just comment this out, and we want to put some context to what we want to do. So we want the first input, which is the number that we'll put. We want the next input, which is also the number that we'll put, and we want to use the following. We want to say if it's our number. So we want our number to be equal to CINT, we open and close brackets, input dot text, and we want to then add our CINT, we open brackets. What was the name of the other input? Num1 dot text, I think that is what, yes, that's what we had actually put it as. So we want to be able to say num1 is equal to our input and our number, and we add that information, right? So what this then means is if we put our message box, we should be able to get the result. Okay, before we run this, what do you think is the output? If at all there's an output. What do you think is the output of the code that I've put there? What could be the output of line 6 especially? It and show you what it gives us. So this is the output we've got, and it, or rather the code we've got. If I run it, right? So let me just share the output so that you guys can see, and then we explain how we can get it working. So we are simply saying, at this particular instance, if I put 34 and 12, if I click on proceed, it should then give me 46. Where are we getting the 46? The first value I put as 34, the next value I put as 12, and when I clicked on proceed, it gave me 46. How did we get 46? It's adding the first value and the second value. So the person who had given us that is concatenating, is that what it's doing? So what is it doing? What is it doing? Because we've got the code. And our code, like we said, we've created a variable. That was the first thing that we did. And the variable that we created was NUM. NUM, after creating a variable NUM, we said NUM is an integer. When it's an integer, we then move on to say after NUM, we say NUM is equal to NUM equals CINT, the value of the text box, plus the value of the next text box, and then we get the answer. So in short, what we are simply saying is we get the value that has been put in our text box. We convert that value to an integer value. The moment we've converted it to an integer value, we want to then use that integer value to add the integer value, and then we display in our message box, where our message box is just giving us the example and the result of whatever it is that we would have wanted to do. Tiritos, pane mubvunzo. Okay, if there are no questions, that's fine. We are getting to the assignment. The assignment that we want to do is we are going to finish this off, but here's how we're going to finish it off. We want to be able to get the value, which is for the first number, where we've got 34. We also want the value for the next number, which is 12, but we want to be able to manipulate the operator. So in this particular instance, we've used the plus operator, but we want to use either plus or minus or multiply or divide, which is the last text box that we've got there. So as your assignment, you are going to figure out how to work with the last text box, which is our operator. So what this then simply means is, let's say I change my values. I put 89 in the first box. I put 57 in the second box. I can put my operator, which can be plus. So it should then tell me 89 plus 57 gives me 146. But I must utilize the text box for the plus. So that is your assignment. That is due, I think, if we can say Wednesday, we are good to go. So we can say that's due by Wednesday. Okay, so let us proceed. Don't worry, again, we say WhatsApp. So, given what we have done, we've just done a simple example on how we can work with our Visual Studio and get certain things done. So let's say we want to create another project. The project So we want to create another project and maybe get designing a little bit more than what we've got there. So let's say we want to create a project. We go to File, we select New, we then select Project. But as you can see on the screen there, you can also create a website. So in other words, we can also create a website through Visual Studio. That's one thing that I think not within this class, but you can also look into and see how you can work with a project. So we select our project, and then as you can see, there's different types of projects. There is Visual C, there's SQL Server, there's other project types. So for example, on your other project types, you can actually create a setup and deployment project, whereby you can create a project that has got an installer. So you can actually work with that in this particular instance, or you can create a solution to our Visual Basic. So it's simply up to you what you can actually work with. But what we want is a Windows project, and then we want a Windows Forms application. Make sure it's a Windows Forms application because that's what we're working with. And then we want to create the title of this particular project. So the name of the project, we want it to be utility. Utility. And then at the same time, you can see that we've got a framework up here. If you are familiar with the framework you want to work with, you can actually be able to change the framework that is available, or you can design a framework that you would want to use for your particular project. So 4.5.2 is fine for us. We can click on OK. But before we go to OK, you can see that you can also go online and look for a template. So you can get a template for whatever element or aspect that you want to work with. So we can click on OK, and then we create our project. So with this project, we want to then do a couple of things. So we want to tweak the project in some way. So first things first, we can actually change the name of the form and we call it utility. Okay. At the same time, with our utility, we can also change certain aspects of this particular form. So for a start, we can go to the icon, and if we've got an icon, we can actually put an icon, but in this instance, we don't have an icon. We can also put a message box whereby with our message box, I can double click on my form and then I have an event called a form loader event. What this simply means is when we are running our project, we can actually have a output, or we can have an event that we can call to give or to display specific aspects. So one of the reasons why we might need to know how some of these things work is as follows. We've got objects, we've also got variables, we've also got event handlers within our Visual Studio. So what our event handlers simply do is, for example, if you want to be able to call on an event, let's say the moment we load this particular form, we want to be able to open a Microsoft Word document. We can actually then call Microsoft Word to start a particular document or to create a particular document. So some of these elements, we then now need to at least understand how they work. And at the same time, if you've noticed, each time that we're creating some code, we started with the button, we also worked with the input, now we are working with the form. Each time we're calling that as an event, we were getting some results. So how did we get to public, private sub, form one, load, sender as object, e as event, whatever, handles my base.load. Okay, we might want to recreate this code. Visual Studio makes life a little bit easier in that I can actually delete my code and recreate it. How do I recreate it? If you remember with our button, we simply came here and we select form one, and then, no, sorry, we want form one events, and then we want load, like that. In other words, we have created an event for our particular form. So in other words, we're then saying when we are loading our form, we want to put something. We can also create another form one event, right? So instead of me.loading, I can say me.closing, right? Whereby we are saying at the moment that I want to close this particular form, I can be able to put whatever it is that I want to put so that I know that the form is closing. One such example is if you've noticed when you're working with a Microsoft application, the moment you want to close it, in some instances it asks you, do you want to close this program? You can say yes or no. That's one of the options that we've got within our Microsoft Visual Studio. Okay, I think roughly with what we have done, I'll continue from where we were. We are saying at this particular instance, let's show what I was just describing. So we want a message box dot show, and then in our message box dot show, we want to say the following. Utility program. Uh, we then want to put something about the program, version 1.01. We then want a message box. Buttons dot yes, no, like that. So what this simply means is we want to be able to say the moment we run this particular form, we want to be able to have the user select an option, whether it's yes or no. And this only runs when we're about to close our form. Okay, it takes a bit of time because it will be loading and doing a couple of things. We'll just wait for it and see how this works. Right, so there's nothing that we'll see on our form, but if I click on the X, it tells me it's version 1.101 and it's a utility program. Do I want to close or not? So if I click on yes, it will then close the program. If I click on no, it should then continue with the given program. And this object is from my system, whereby I'm saying import system.datetime. I then need to have an object for the date and the time. So in essence, we are then always saying whatever we have learned, we can always then apply it to the new language that we're working with. At the same time, if you remember, in our C or in our PHP, we could also create a function. So we can put function names, and then we've got a function, whereby with our function, we can also say string first name. Sorry, my mistake. I don't think we can put it as that, but we can have it as function names, where we then now need to figure out how do we make our function work. So we then also need to have a set of parameters that we can use to ensure that our function will work according to whatever privileges we want to use within our code, or how our code should be working. At the same time, we can also have a case statement. I think uh no, I'm forgetting how we put the syntax. I'm forgetting how we put some of the syntax. But like we also said, we can also put dim names as string. We have declared a string value. But at the same time now, with what I've put there, you then get to see that I've got a problem. Where's my problem? Line number 8 and line number 3 have got the same object name. So it then means if we've got that, it will give us an error. We now need to change one of the elements to suit whatever it is that we are hoping to achieve or to use within our code or our syntax. I think with that, we can safely